Quentyn Martell is a bizarre character in A Song of Ice and Fire. He comes out of precisely nowhere, has 4 chapters in A Dance with Dragons, and then dies a terrible fiery death at the end of that book. Or does he? There's a very famous theory by the one and only Preston Jacobs that Quentyn Martell is in fact alive, that his supposed death at the end of A Dance with Dragons is a fake out, and he'll be alive and well in the Winds of Winter should that book ever be published. I've been asked my opinion on that theory several times over the years, and today I wanted to delve into Quentyn's fate and his potential role in the story, as I think it is an interesting idea to examine, regardless of whether or not you think it could be true. Let's go over the situation a little bit. In Quentyn's final chapter, entitled The Dragontamer, he delves into the Great Pyramids of Meereen to retrieve Daenerys' 2 dragons, Rhaegal and Viserion, who have been pinned there for the entirety of the book. Drogon did not end up getting imprisoned like them and has already flown off with Daenerys, but there are 2 dragons left, and Quentyn wants to free them and claim one for himself, as the chapter title would imply. He goes in with his 2 friends and a bunch of soldiers, and ends up finding them and having a moment where it looks like he's going to tame Viserion, but then Rhaegal pops up and sets him on fire, and he then observes that he is burning, all of him is burning, and his last thought is, "Oh," and then he starts to scream. We then see him in Barristan's final chapter, The Queen's Hand, where he's been dying for 3 days in a bed. His body is virtually unrecognizable here, his eyes are gone, he is smiling, which is strange for Quentyn, though corpses that have been burned to that degree do tend to just be smiling, and the thought is that, oh, there was maybe a switch, and maybe this is one of the Windblown who has now taken Quentyn's place here. I think that Quentyn is probably dead. I think there's about a 99% chance that Quentyn is dead. But I think that this theory has identified something really interesting here. I think that Martin has intentionally left open a trapdoor for himself, a break glass in case of emergency, and I think that is what Quentyn's fate being at least a little bit ambiguous is. I think that Preston Jacobs has correctly pointed out that there are a number of inconsistencies and ambiguities to this story as we know it. I don't think that that's going to necessarily yield Quentyn being alive, but I think that Martin has reason to allow himself a back door to get out of this character's death if he is to find that he needs Quentyn Martell in the Winds of Winter. We know that in the past, George R. R. Martin has regretted killing at least one character off. There's that very famous quote where he told another author that he had painted himself into a corner by killing someone and is now having trouble writing the future of one particular story in the Winds of Winter. My theory has always been that regretted death was Aemon Targaryen, the old maester from the Wall, who dies with Sam in A Feast for Crows. Sam doesn't die too, he dies while he's with Sam. I think that that death very much creates complications in a number of stories, and I think Martin knew that and very much regretted that going into writing A Dance with Dragons. And I think maybe because of that, he built some ambiguities into Quentyn's death just in case he finds that, oh, I need to have Quentyn alive for some reason or another. That would make the story a lot easier and it makes more sense. So yeah, I can make it a switch out, a change up, whatever, what have you. And I think that is Martin's thinking in having there be some ambiguity there. I think that also fits in with how Martin writes Meereen in general. This area of the story is very famously a massive knot for Martin. There are so many characters and plot lines converging all around Daenerys Targaryen, and he very famously ripped apart and rewrote this story time after time after time. In reference to Quentyn specifically, he says there are many different ways he envisioned events. He had Quentyn arriving much earlier, he had Quentyn arriving much later, he had Quentyn arriving just before Daenerys' wedding, which is what he ended up going with, but all of these stories were written by Martin at some point. I think that Martin has shown that Quentyn's story is something that he is very actively kind of restructuring and fitting into the narrative as he needs it to kind of be in this finished state, and I think that his death is no different. I think that Quentyn is probably dead, but I think that Martin knows there is a non-zero chance I need to rip this apart again, and Quentyn will need to be alive in this version, so yeah, I'm going to make it a little bit vague. I also think if you look at the Dragontamer as a chapter, it thematically very much conveys why Quentyn is dead. That chapter in Quentyn's head is very much about his father. fire, Duran Martell, and what Duran wants for Quentyn. He wants fire and blood. He wants to unite the Dornish with the Targaryens and bring justice to the Lannisters who have wronged the Martells in so many ways over the past several decades. Quentyn pursues taming this dragon not only because he wants to be his hero, but he wants to make his father proud. It's a very relatable sentiment, and I think it is fascinating, and I think it is a big part of this character, and I think it does tie into why Quentyn dies here. Because I think Quentyn's death is going to be very important to the Dornish storyline as a whole. At present, Duran doesn't know what's going on with Quentyn, and Duran is very ready to still back Daenerys Targaryen, thinking there could be an alliance via her marrying Quentyn. Once he hears of Quentyn's death, I think he'll be even further in on Aegon's cause, and I think that'll be a big reason as to why the Dornish will not support Daenerys in her invasion of the Seven Kingdoms, and I think it'll be pretty politically important there. Though we do know that Daenerys won't come into direct conflict with Duran. We know that she won't burn the Water Gardens, because Martin has directly said no on that point to a fan. I think there are also other reasons to not have Quentyn survive in a metatextual sense. Specifically, we have two big viewpoint deaths at the end of It Ends with Dragons. We have Quentyn Martell and we have Jon Snow, and we all know that Jon Snow is going to be coming back from the dead at some point or another. Some think he's not fully dead and he's just kind of bleeding out, injured, comatose, what have you, while his soul is in Ghost. I think that he is probably dead, but his soul is in Ghost, and there will be some ritual to resurrect. I have a video on that, but regardless, I think that it would very much diminish the weight of character deaths in general if the two viewpoints who die at the end of Dance both come back in the Winds of Winter. I think that would be very strange, and while Martin has brought viewpoints back in the past, that being Catelyn, it has been something he's done very sparingly. I do still really like the Quentyn is alive theory, though, and there are some very interesting details pointed out that I do very much think are accurate to the version of events as they happen in the books, most notably the oil on the leather whip being the thing to actually catch fire. I think that was very much what started this kind of flame, but that said, I don't think this oil would be on all of Quentyn, and he says that all of him is on fire, which does make me think that there was more than just the oil on fire, and maybe he caught maybe an indirect blast, but still burned to death, which would account for the lower level of heat and the eyes not melting and brass on the whip not melting. I also think this is some important setup for the Winds of Winter, because I think that not only is Quentyn's death politically important, his interactions with the dragons very much set the stage for what's to come in the future of the story, as I think that we are going to see individuals claim both Rhaegal and Viserion later on in the Winds of Winter and in the Dream of Spring, and it's fascinating because Quentyn has very little dragon blood. He has some from Targaryens who have married into the Martells, but beyond that, he has very little, but it does still seem like there's a moment where he starts to bond with Viserion and where Viserion might have started to accept him, but then Rhaegal intervenes and ends up messing all of that up. If there's an environment where these dragons are isolated and we could see some situation where they are kind of more docile and satisfied around someone who might not even have any, if a little, Targaryen blood, it could be maybe slightly easier to claim them than we previously expected. I also think there are other kind of meta reasons for keeping Quentyn dead, notably that The Winds of Winter is going to be an overstuffed book to begin with. We're starting with 20 viewpoint characters and a prologue, and there are entire videos, one by Admiral Kurd jumps to mind, dedicated to effectively trying to fit The Winds of Winter in The Winds of Winter. I think this book will ultimately need to be split for length at some point. I think that problem would very much be exacerbated by having another extra viewpoint come back from the dead, and I think that Quentyn would very much come back as a viewpoint if he were to survive, and I just don't think the book has that much room for it, as I think that, I don't know, Jon could come back as a non-viewpoint character, which could end up kind of making things a bit more efficient there too, so more reason for him to come back and Quentyn to maybe not. To summarize and clarify my thoughts, I think there is a world where George R.R. Martin decides that Quentyn Martell has survived his encounter with the dragons, and I think he has correctly built up the architecture to allow that to happen and allow Quentyn's death to be a fake out, as has happened with so many other characters in the story, i.e. Davos, Bran, etc. But I think that is very unlikely to happen for both narrative and metatextual reasons, in that Quentyn Martell is very much dead. He has a narrative role as a dead character, and the story doesn't super seem like it would fit him at this stage going forward, given the fact that Martin already has so much to juggle, especially in Marine. I think he's a fascinating character, and his death will have impacts across the entirety of the series, but it is ultimately unclear as to what's going to happen until The Winds of Winter ends up being released at some point. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It's free and it really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments what you think of this theory, what you think of Quentyn and his fate and his story. I'd love to hear your opinions. And yeah, I'll have many more videos on A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, Duncan Egg, Game of Thrones for you in the very near future. Thank you again so much for watching. I will see you all soon. Thank you again. I already thanked you. Goodbye.